Before you close your eyes tonight, I want to tell you about a secret meeting that changed the fate of millions of people. A meeting so quiet, so hidden, that most of the world didn't know it happened until it was too late. Two men in a private office in London drew a line across a map of the Middle East with a pencil. That line, that single, unremarkable pencil stroke, created borders that still bleed today. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire. 600 years of power, slowly, quietly, secretly undone. Not on a battlefield, not in a single moment, but through whispered deals in candlelit rooms, broken promises written in careful, diplomatic language, and maps drawn by men who had never once set foot in the lands they were dividing. Settle in. Let the weight of the day leave your body. Tonight, we go back, all the way back, to the last days of the greatest empire the Middle East has ever known.
Chapter 1. The Giant That Ruled the World. Close your eyes and travel back. Not to the ruins you may have seen in photographs, not to the faded maps in history books. Travel back to the living empire, the breathing, thundering, magnificent empire at its absolute peak. The year is 1520. Constantinople, the city they now call Istanbul, is the greatest city on earth. Walk through its streets and you will hear a dozen languages before you reach the end of the first alley. Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Armenian, Ladino, Persian. The city is a marketplace of civilizations, a crossroads where the ancient world and the modern world meet, and do not yet know they are rivals. At the heart of the city stands the Topkapi Palace, a city within the city. Behind its walls, fountains play in courtyard gardens. Scholars debate philosophy in vaulted libraries. Physicians practice medicine that Europeans will not understand for another century. Artists lay tiles of brilliant blue and white that seem to capture the sky and press it into ceramic. And at the center of all this, on the throne of thrones, sits Suleiman. They call him Suleiman the Magnificent. His own people call him Suleiman Kanuni, the lawgiver. Both names are correct. Both names are insufficient. He rules an empire that stretches from the gates of Vienna in the west to the borders of Persia in the east, from the steppes of Ukraine in the north to the tip of the Arabian Peninsula in the south, from the shores of Morocco and Algeria in Africa to the mountains of Kurdistan. He controls the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He is the Caliph, the defender of the faith, for 300 million Muslims across the world. No single ruler on earth commands more. No single court is more brilliant. No single treasury is more full. Let that settle for a moment. This is where the story begins. Not with collapse, not with war, not with betrayal. It begins here, at the summit. Because to understand what was lost, you must first understand what existed. The Ottoman Empire was not an accident. It was built over 2.5 centuries by a succession of extraordinary men. It began with a small Anatolian principality in the early 1300s. A Turkic chief named Osman led a band of warriors in the northwest corner of what is now Turkey. His followers called themselves Osmanlilar, the people of Osman. The Europeans turned this into a single word, Ottoman. From that small beginning, the empire grew. Slowly at first, then with astonishing speed. The key moment came on a Tuesday morning in May 1453. The young Sultan, Mehmed II, just 21 years old, had been told the walls of Constantinople were impregnable. He had been told the city had held against every attacker for over 1,000 years. He had been told it was impossible. He ordered his engineers to build the largest cannons the world had ever seen. He had them drag those cannons over land for miles. And on the 29th of May, 1453, the walls of Constantinople, which had held for 11 centuries, fell. Mehmed rode through the breach on his white horse and dismounted at the door of the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. He knelt, picked up a handful of earth, and poured it over his head. An act of humility, a reminder, even in total victory, of human smallness before God. Then he walked inside. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque, the city became a capital, and the Ottoman Empire became something new. The inheritor of both the Roman tradition and the Islamic Caliphate. Mehmed himself began calling himself Caesar. For the next 200 years, the empire expanded without pause. Selim I, Suleiman's father, doubled the empire's size in just 8 years. He defeated the Persian Safavids. He conquered Egypt and Syria. He brought the holy cities of Mecca and Medina under Ottoman protection. And then Suleiman took the throne, and the Golden Age truly began. He modernized the legal system, creating a code of laws so comprehensive and just that his successors would not improve upon it for centuries. He built mosques, bridges, aqueducts, and hospitals across the empire. He launched an extraordinary arts program. He corresponded with European monarchs as equals and was recognized as such. His admiral, Barbarossa, ruled the Mediterranean Sea. His army marched to the walls of Vienna. His architects built the Suleymaniye Mosque, which still stands today, still breathes, still draws the breath from your chest when you walk inside. This was the Ottoman Empire at its peak. A civilization, a system of governance, a way of life for millions of people of dozens of faiths and hundreds of languages, held together not by one ethnicity, but by one structure, one law, one sovereignty. And it worked. For a very long time, it genuinely worked. But nothing stays at its peak. Not rivers, not mountains, not empires. The questions that will haunt the rest of this story are already waiting in the shadows. When did the rot begin? Was it visible? Did anyone try to stop it? And who, in the end, delivered the final blow? Let the night carry you forward. We are only at the beginning. Chapter 2. The Slow Rot. Every great empire carries the seeds of its own decline from the very beginning. The Ottoman Empire was no different. For 2 centuries after Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire endured. It did not grow as it had grown before, but it held. It governed. It administered millions of lives with a degree of order and stability that most of the world could only envy. But beneath the surface, slowly, quietly, like water finding its way through stone, something was changing. The first sign was the military. Suleiman's army had been the most feared force in the known world. The Janissaries, the elite infantry corps, had been the empire's iron spine. They were recruited as children from Christian families across the Balkans and Anatolia, converted to Islam, trained from boyhood as warriors, and given total loyalty to the Sultan and to nothing else. No family ties, no inheritance, no outside interests, just the blade and the banner. It was a brutal system. It was also remarkably effective. But over time, the Janissaries changed. They were allowed to marry, to pass membership to their sons, to run businesses, to own property. The warrior monks became a guild, a union, an interest group with too much power and too little discipline. By the 17th century, the Janissaries were making and unmaking sultans. They revolted when they disliked a commander. They resisted every attempt at reform. And the empire's military, once at the cutting edge of global warfare, began to fall behind. Europe, meanwhile, was accelerating. This is the part of the story that is easy to miss, the quiet revolution that happened not on battlefields, but in workshops, counting houses, and laboratories. Europe in the 17th century was transforming itself. The scientific revolution, the printing press spreading knowledge to every corner, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in England, new trade routes around Africa that bypassed the Ottoman middlemen entirely. The wealth that had once flowed through Constantinople began to flow around it. And on the 12th of September, 1683, a date that reverberates through history like a struck bell, the Ottoman army stood before the walls of Vienna for the second time, and this time they failed. The Battle of Vienna was the turning point. The Ottoman advance into Europe, which had seemed unstoppable for 2 centuries, was broken. A relief army of Polish, German, and Habsburg forces under King John III of Poland smashed into the Ottoman lines from the hills. The greatest Ottoman army ever assembled fled south. It would never come back. The decades that followed brought loss after loss. Hungary, the Balkans, the northern shores of the Black Sea. Each treaty signed by the Ottomans was a concession. Each concession was a humiliation. Each humiliation was a lesson that the empire's rulers tried, and mostly failed, to learn from. In 1798, a young French general named Napoleon Bonaparte sailed an army to Egypt and defeated the Mamluk forces in a single afternoon. Egypt, an Ottoman province, had been invaded by a foreign power, and the Ottoman Empire could not stop it. The message was devastating, clear, impossible to ignore. The empire was falling behind, not just militarily, economically, technologically, institutionally. By the early 19th century, European ambassadors had taken to calling the Ottoman Empire by a name that would stick like a wound: the sick man of Europe. Sultan Mahmud II, one of the more remarkable sultans of the decline era, understood this clearly. In 1826, he abolished the Janissaries in a single violent act that would be remembered as the auspicious incident. The Janissaries resisted. He had them massacred. It was brutal. It was necessary. And it was too late. The empire needed not just a new army, but a new everything. New industry, new education, new administration, new ideas. In 1839, the government issued the Tanzimat, a sweeping series of reforms that attempted to modernize Ottoman society in a generation. Equal rights for all citizens regardless of religion, an end to tax farming, a reorganized bureaucracy, new schools, a new legal code. The reforms were real. Some of them worked. But they also created new problems. They alarmed conservative religious leaders. They angered the old elites who profited from the old corruption. And they raised expectations. Among the empire's Christian minorities, among educated young Muslims, among Arab intellectuals, that the empire could not always meet. Meanwhile, the territories kept fragmenting. Greece won its independence in 1830 with the help of Britain, France, and Russia. Serbia gained autonomy. Romania, Bulgaria. One by one, the empire's European provinces broke away, often with the active encouragement of the great European powers who were already thinking about what they would inherit when the empire finally collapsed. By 1878, the Ottoman Empire had lost nearly all of its European territories. Cyprus had been handed to Britain as a bribe to stay neutral in a war with Russia. Bosnia and Herzegovina occupied by Austria-Hungary. The money ran out too. In 1875, the Ottoman government announced it could not repay its foreign debts. European creditors, led by British and French banks, took control of Ottoman finances. A council of foreign bondholders effectively became the empire's treasury. The sick man of Europe was now also bankrupt. But the empire was not dead. Not yet. It still controlled vast territories: the Arabian Peninsula, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Mesopotamia, Anatolia itself, the heartland, was still intact. And in the shadows, a new generation was watching, learning, seething with ambition and frustration and a furious desire to save what remained. They were coming. But first, the empire would need to survive its darkest sultan. Rest in the silence for a moment. The world of the 19th century was a world in motion, and the Ottoman Empire was being dragged along whether it wished to move or not. We continue soon. Chapter 3. The Secret Society. It began with 6 young men in a basement. Istanbul, 1889. The Imperial Military Medical School, a city of spies and whispers, where walls had ears and ambition had consequences. These 6 young men, students, officers, idealists, had watched their empire bleed. They had seen province after province fall away. They had watched their sultan, Abdul Hamid II, govern from behind locked palace gates, surrounded by spies, sustained by fear. Abdul Hamid II, history would give him a name: the Red Sultan. Not for his robes, for what he did to those who opposed him. He had come to power in 1876, in the chaos that followed the disastrous wars with Russia. He had briefly permitted a constitution. He had briefly allowed a parliament. And then, 18 months later, he had suspended both. He dissolved the parliament. He tore up the constitution. He built the most extensive spy network in the empire's history, a web of informants so fine that no conversation could be assumed safe. He banned books. He banned words. The word dynamite was forbidden in print. So was the phrase assassination. So, at one point, was the word liberty. He ruled through paranoia, through isolation, through the slow strangulation of every competing power center in the empire. And yet, he was not entirely wrong. The empire was surrounded by predators. Russia wanted the Black Sea Straits. Britain wanted Egypt and beyond. France wanted Syria. Austria-Hungary wanted the Balkans. Every great power was already calculating what it would take when the empire fell. Abdul Hamid was determined not to give them the opportunity. His terror was the terror of a man who understood very clearly what was coming. But that understanding did not make him wise. It made him cruel. And it made him enemies. Back in that basement in 1889, those 6 medical students were writing a constitution. They were inspired by the French and American revolutions, by the writings of Namik Kemal, the great Ottoman liberal who had died in exile a year before, by the dream, fragile, stubborn, persistent, that the empire could be saved not through repression, but through reform. They called their organization the Committee of Union and Progress. Within years, it had spread far beyond the medical school, to the military academies, to the officer corps, to the great garrison city of Thessaloniki in Macedonia, a cosmopolitan city of Greeks, Jews, Bulgarians, and Turks, where conspiratorial politics seemed to grow like weeds between the cobblestones. By 1900, the organization had thousands of members, cells in every major city, coded communications, hidden printing presses producing pamphlets that were passed hand to hand in coffee houses and barracks. The Europeans called them the Young Turks. They were not all Turks. They were Albanians and Macedonians and Arabs and Jews and Circassians. But they shared one conviction, that the empire needed to change or die. The exiles wrote and argued in the cafes of Paris and Geneva. Ahmed Riza became the public intellectual face, demanding constitutionalism through peaceful means. Others wanted revolution. They debated endlessly about what the new empire would look like. Would it be a mosaic, with all peoples equal? Or would it be Turkish at its heart? That debate would prove fatal. But in those early years, the dream was still beautiful. Then came 1908. A military officer in Macedonia, a man named Ahmed Niazi, could wait no longer. He took his battalion into the mountains and declared a revolution. Within days, other officers followed. The army in Macedonia declared for the constitution. Abdul Hamid had suppressed revolts before, but this was different. This was the army, his own army, the force on which every Ottoman sultan's power ultimately rested. He made the only move available to him. On the 24th of July, 1908, the Sultan announced the restoration of the constitution. The parliament would be recalled. Censorship would be lifted. Political prisoners would be freed. And the city went mad with joy. In the streets of Istanbul, crowds wept and embraced. Turks hugged Greeks. Muslims embraced Armenians. A generation of exiles boarded trains from Paris and Geneva and Vienna to come home. Newspapers printed headlines that would have earned their editors prison or death a week before. For one brief, luminous, fragile moment, it seemed as if the empire might actually be reborn. But power is not given up easily. Abdul Hamid tried one last counter-revolution in April 1909. He failed. The Young Turk army marched on Istanbul. They deposed him, put him on a train to Thessaloniki, and appointed his brother as a ceremonial sultan with no real power. The revolution had succeeded. The empire was theirs to save. What happened next is one of the great tragedies of modern history, because the Young Turks were idealists. And then, slowly, under the pressure of war and fear and impossible circumstances, they became something else entirely. Within 3 years, power within the Committee of Union and Progress had concentrated into the hands of 3 men: Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, Cemal Pasha. The 3 Pashas. The triumvirate who would steer the empire into catastrophe. Enver, brilliant, vain, obsessed with military glory, infatuated with German efficiency. Talat, cold, calculating, the supreme political strategist who genuinely believed he could save the empire through sheer force of will. Kemal, powerful, brutal, the iron administrator. 3 men, and a dying empire, and a world on the brink of a war that would consume them all. Sleep gently. The revolution is over. The reckoning is just beginning. Chapter 4. The World on Fire. The summer of 1914 was the last ordinary summer the world would know for a very long time. In the coffee houses of Istanbul, men smoked and played backgammon and argued about politics. In the great imperial palaces, bureaucrats shuffled papers and debated reform. In the barracks across Anatolia, soldiers drilled in the heat. Life moved at the pace of horses and letters. The telegraph was modern, the motorcar was a curiosity. And in Sarajevo, a city in the Habsburg province of Bosnia, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip waited at a cafe. On the morning of the 28th of June, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was driven through the streets of Sarajevo in an open motorcar. An assassination attempt earlier that morning had failed. The Archduke's motorcade took a wrong turn. The car stopped to reverse. Princip was sitting at the cafe on that corner. He stood. He drew his pistol. He fired twice. 2 shots. That is all it took to end one world and begin another. What followed was almost mechanical in its horror. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany mobilized to defend Austria-Hungary. France mobilized in response to Germany. Britain entered to defend Belgian neutrality. Within 6 weeks, the largest war in history was underway. And the Ottoman Empire, weakened, bankrupt, internally divided, stood at the crossroads of the world and had to choose a side. The 3 pashas debated. They understood that whatever they chose, the empire would be in danger. Neutrality was an illusion. The great powers would not allow the Ottoman territories to sit untouched when the war was over. The winner, whoever won, would carve up what remained. The question was not whether the empire would be carved up. The question was whether it could survive at all. Britain and France were the old enemies, the powers that had taken Egypt, that had occupied Cyprus, that had humiliated the empire for a century. To join them felt impossible. They could not be trusted. But Germany was different. Germany was new. Germany was powerful and rising, and had not yet had its share of Ottoman territory. Germany had invested in the empire. German military advisors had trained Ottoman officers. German engineers had begun building the Baghdad Railway. German banks had financed infrastructure. And Germany was willing to offer an alliance of equals. On the 2nd of August, 1914, just days after war was declared in Europe, the Ottoman Empire and Germany signed a secret military treaty. Then the Germans made a gift that removed any remaining ambiguity.
2 German warships, the battlecruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau, had been operating in the Mediterranean when war was declared. The Royal Navy gave chase. The German ships fled east, seeking sanctuary. They sailed through the Dardanelles Straits into the Sea of Marmara and anchored beneath the walls of Istanbul. The Ottoman government purchased them on paper. The German crews put on Ottoman fezzes. The ships were renamed. But beneath the fezzes were German officers. Beneath the Ottoman flags were German guns. In October 1914, those ships sailed into the Black Sea and bombarded the Russian port of Odessa. The Ottoman Empire was at war. The 3 pashas had committed their empire to the German side. They believed they had no choice, and they still believed, with the extraordinary optimism of men who have convinced themselves of their own necessity, that they could win. What followed was catastrophe upon catastrophe. The Caucasus Campaign, launched by Enver Pasha himself in the bitter winter of 1914, ended in disaster at the Battle of Sarikamish. 90,000 Ottoman soldiers sent into the frozen mountains of eastern Anatolia, 60,000 dead. Not from Russian bullets, from cold, from starvation, from Enver's military vanity. The Sinai campaign against British-held Egypt stalled. The Mesopotamia campaign, launched to defend the oil-rich territories near Basra, began to unravel slowly and expensively. An entire British army would eventually surrender at Kut in 1916, the largest British surrender since the American Revolution. And then, Gallipoli. In early 1915, Winston Churchill,
then First Lord of the Admiralty, proposed a bold stroke that would change the war in a single move. Force open the Dardanelles Straits, capture Istanbul, knock the Ottomans out of the war, open a supply route to Russia through the Black Sea. It was brilliant in conception. It was catastrophic in execution. The naval assault in February 1915 failed when 3 Allied battleships were sunk by mines. The land assault, a massive amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April 1915, was pinned down on the beaches within hours. The Ottoman forces holding the heights had been organized by a previously unknown lieutenant colonel, a man who had sat in the corner of the Young Turks movement, never fully trusted, never fully in power. A man who was brilliant, ferocious, and certain of himself to the point of mysticism. Mustafa Kemal. At a critical moment, early on the 25th of April, Kemal saw Allied troops advancing up a ridge toward positions that were not yet held. He had no orders. He had no reserves. He had only 1 battalion and his own judgment. He turned to his soldiers and said words that would become immortal. "I am not ordering you to attack. I am ordering you to die. In the time that passes until we die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places." They held the ridge. For 9 months, men died on those cliffs and beaches, in their hundreds of thousands. British, Australian, New Zealander, French, Indian, Ottoman. The numbers were staggering. The conditions were medieval. The tactics were suicidal. In December 1915, the Allied forces evacuated, quietly, in the night, leaving their dead in the ground. Gallipoli was the Ottoman Empire's only clean victory in the entire war. And the man who had won it, Mustafa Kemal, had begun his transformation into something larger than a soldier. But the empire was bleeding, from a dozen wounds at once. And in the chaos and the fear and the fever of wartime nationalism, something terrible was being prepared. Something that would mark the empire forever. We will reach it. Not yet. First, we need to follow the letters. Letters written in secret, full of promises that were never meant to be kept. Let the stillness hold you. The world is on fire, but you are safe here, in the dark, listening. Chapter 5. Letters in the Desert. While the great powers fought their war in Europe, while men died in the mud of Flanders and the cliffs of Gallipoli, a very different kind of war was being planned in candlelit rooms and desert tents. A war of words, of promises, of letters. And those letters would shape the Middle East for the next century. To understand them, you need to understand a man named Hussein bin Ali. Hussein was the Sharif of Mecca, the guardian of Islam's holiest city, appointed by the Ottoman Sultan himself. He was a man of 60 in 1914, dignified, deeply religious, proud of his Hashemite lineage that traced directly back to the Prophet Muhammad. He had governed Mecca for a decade under Ottoman authority, navigating the complex politics of a man who was respected by all sides and trusted by none. When the war began, Hussein faced an impossible choice. The Ottoman Sultan, under pressure from the German alliance, had declared a holy war, a jihad, against the Allies. Every Muslim on earth was called to fight for the Ottoman cause. The Sultan was the Caliph. His word, in theory, was binding. But Hussein hesitated. He watched. He calculated. He was not loyal to the Ottoman Empire as an institution. He was loyal to Islam. And he believed, with growing conviction, that the Ottomans, under the three pashas, were leading Islam toward destruction. So he listened when the British came calling. The British representative was Henry McMahon, the High Commissioner for Egypt, based in Cairo. Egypt was under British occupation. Britain desperately needed to neutralize the Ottoman declaration of jihad, which was causing unrest across British India, across Egypt, across the Muslim populations of the entire empire. An Arab revolt against the Ottomans would accomplish several things at once. It would undermine the jihad. It would open a second front against the Ottomans in the Arabian Peninsula. It would protect the Suez Canal. And it might, if handled correctly, lay the foundations of a British-aligned Arab world after the war. McMahon began writing to Hussein in July 1915. And here is where the story becomes labyrinthine. Because what McMahon offered, and what Hussein understood him to be offering, were not entirely the same thing. McMahon's letters promised British support for Arab independence. Not just independence for a city or a province, but independence for the vast Arab heartland. Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, the entire Fertile Crescent, the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. The exact wording was carefully vague, deliberately so. McMahon carved out exceptions for regions where France had interests, a phrase designed to be flexible. He left the boundaries undefined. He spoke of Arab independence without specifying what form it would take. Hussein read the letters as a promise, a solemn undertaking from the greatest empire on earth. Britain would support Arab independence across all the lands of the Arab people. He was not wrong to read them that way. But he was not entirely right. On the 5th of June 1916, Hussein ibn Ali raised the flag of the Arab revolt. From Mecca, his sons, Faisal, Abdullah, Ali, and Zaid, led armies of Arab tribal warriors northward. They cut telegraph lines. They ambushed Ottoman supply trains. They attacked garrisons. They swept through the Hijaz, the western coast of Arabia, with extraordinary speed. The British sent gold. They sent weapons. They sent advisors. One of those advisors would become the most famous Englishman of his generation. But Hussein's revolt was more than a military operation. It was a declaration. It said, "The Arab people are not subjects. They are a nation. They have a history and a culture and a right to govern themselves." After 400 years of Ottoman rule and centuries of tribal fragmentation, the idea of a unified Arab nation was taking shape. In the encampments and the desert towns, men told each other, "After the war, everything changes. After the war, we will be free." They believed it. They had been given every reason to believe it. What they did not know, what Hussein did not know, what his sons did not know, what the Arab tribal leaders riding into Ottoman artillery fire did not know, was what was being agreed at exactly the same time, in a private office in London, between two men with a map and a pencil. They did not know about Sykes. They did not know about Picot. They did not know that as they fought and died for the dream of Arab independence, that dream was being divided, before it was even born, between two European powers who had not the slightest intention of honoring the promises their colleague had made in Cairo. Let the desert wind carry this thought for a moment. The letters that launched a revolution were written in good faith by some men, and read in good faith by others. But between the writing and the reading, somewhere in the gap between the careful English diplomatic prose and the Arabic translations in the candle-lit tents of the Hijaz,
Something essential had been lost, or perhaps deliberately hidden. The night deepens. The fires in the desert are burning. And in London, a very different meeting is about to take place. Rest. Listen. We continue.
Chapter 6. The Secret Map. In November of 1915, two men met in a private room in London. They were not heads of state. They were not generals. They were diplomats, talented, ambitious, and trusted by their respective governments to solve a problem that no one wanted to discuss in public. The problem was this. Britain and France had been promising victory. They had told their people that this war, the most terrible war in history, was being fought for freedom and justice and the rights of small nations. It was being fought to make the world safe for ordinary people. But privately, in their foreign ministries and in their colonial offices, both governments were having a very different conversation. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, as everyone now assumed it would, who would get what? The first man was Mark Sykes, British, 36 years old, a conservative member of parliament who had travelled extensively through the Middle East and considered himself an expert on its peoples and politics. He was energetic, opinionated, charming, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who has read about places he has not truly understood. The second man was François-Georges Picot, French, a career diplomat, the son of a founder of the Action Française nationalist movement. He represented France's deep and long-standing conviction that Syria, ancient, cultured, Christian in significant part, was rightfully a French domain. Together, they negotiated the agreement that would carry their names forever. They spread a map of the Middle East across the table. The map showed Ottoman territories: Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Mesopotamia, and the vast empty spaces of the Arabian Peninsula. And they began to draw. Britain would take direct control of southern Mesopotamia, the territory we now call southern Iraq, including Baghdad and Basra. Britain would also have a zone of influence across central Arabia and what is now Jordan. France would take direct control of the Lebanese coast and parts of southern Anatolia. France would have a zone of influence across the interior of Syria, including Damascus, the ancient capital of the Arab world. Palestine, the Holy Land, the center of three world religions, the most contested piece of ground on earth, would be placed under international administration. The agreement was signed on the 19th of May, 1916. The same week, Hussein ibn Ali was finalizing the preparations for his Arab revolt. The revolt he was launching on the basis of British promises of Arab independence. He did not know about Sykes-Picot. No one told him. The Arab revolt was launched on the 5th of June, 1916. Arab men went to war and died for a promise that had already been secretly broken. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was one of the most consequential acts of diplomatic duplicity in modern history. Not because it was uniquely evil, empires have always made secret deals, but because of the gap between what it promised and what it betrayed. Because of the millions of people whose futures it determined without asking their opinion. Because the lines drawn on that map in 1916 became the borders of the modern Middle East. The straight lines you see on a map of Iraq and Syria and Jordan, lines that cut across tribal territories, that divide the same people between different countries, that join together peoples who had no history of shared governance. Those lines trace back to this room, to this table, to these two men. Sykes himself later expressed doubts. He came to understand, toward the end of his short life, he died in the influenza pandemic of 1919, aged 39, that the agreement had been a mistake. that the Arab peoples had been treated not as human beings, with aspirations and cultures and rights, but as territories to be divided between colonial powers. But the map had been drawn. The lines had been inked. And maps, once drawn, are very difficult to undraw. There is one more promise we have not yet spoken of, the most explosive promise of all, the one that would turn the entire arrangement into a triangle of impossible contradictions. It was written not in a letter to a desert chieftain, not in a secret diplomatic treaty. It was written on a single page of notepaper, addressed to a private citizen and released to the newspapers of London. It was signed by the British Foreign Secretary. His name was Arthur James Balfour, and what he wrote, 67 words, would set the Middle East on fire for generations to come. Let the dark hold you quietly. We are approaching the heart of it now. Chapter 7. The Third Promise. The Balfour Declaration. 67 words, written on a single sheet of Foreign Office notepaper, dated the 2nd of November, 1917. It read, His Majesty's Government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. 67 words that would define a century of conflict. To understand why the British government wrote these words, you need to understand the world of 1917. The war was going badly. The Western Front had consumed an entire generation in 4 years of slaughter for gains measured in yards. The Russian Empire had collapsed into revolution. The United States had entered the war in April, but American troops had not yet arrived in numbers. The mood in London was desperate. And the Zionist movement had been petitioning the British government for exactly this statement for years. Zionism, the movement for the establishment of a Jewish homeland, had begun in the 1890s, largely in response to the pogroms and institutionalized anti-Semitism that Jews faced across Europe and Russia. Its founding intellectual was a Viennese journalist named Theodor Herzl, who argued with passionate clarity that European Jews could never be safe in Europe, that they needed a land of their own. Herzl had died in 1904, exhausted and heartbroken. But the movement he had founded continued. By 1917, the key figure in the British-Zionist relationship was a chemist named Chaim Weizmann, a Russian-born Jew who had settled in Manchester, become a British subject, and through sheer brilliance and tireless diplomacy had made himself indispensable to the British war effort. His discovery of a new process for manufacturing acetone, essential for munitions, had given him access to the highest levels of the British government. Weizmann argued his case for a Jewish homeland with extraordinary skill, and the British had reasons of their own to be sympathetic. Some of those reasons were idealistic. There was a genuine strand of Christian Zionism in the British establishment, a romantic, biblical attachment to the idea of the Jewish people returning to the Holy Land. Prime Minister Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour himself had been raised on the Old Testament and felt its pull. Some of those reasons were strategic. Britain wanted Zionist support among Jews in the United States, who it was hoped would push American public opinion toward greater involvement in the war. It wanted to outmaneuver France in Palestine. It wanted to secure the approaches to the Suez Canal, and some of those reasons were simply imperial. A British-aligned Jewish presence in Palestine would anchor British influence in the territory after the war. The declaration was drafted, debated, revised, weakened, strengthened, and finally sent. The key phrase, and the one that would prove most contested in the century that followed, was the caveat. Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Those existing non-Jewish communities were the Arab majority, roughly 90% of Palestine's population at the time. They were not consulted. Their existence was acknowledged only in the negative, defined by what they were not. So now the map held 3 promises. To the Arabs, Britain would support Arab independence across the Middle East. Correspondence, letters in the desert. To the French, Britain agreed to divide the Arab world into spheres of European influence. Sykes-Picot, the secret treaty. To the Jewish people, Britain would use its best endeavors to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration. 3 promises, 3 peoples, 1 land. All 3 made by the same government, none of them fully compatible with the others. In the years that followed, British officials would spend decades trying to square this circle, trying to honor all 3 promises simultaneously, finding it impossible, and ultimately satisfying none of them completely. The consequences of that impossible triangle are still being lived out today. But in November 1917, most of the people affected did not yet know what had been promised in their names. The war was still going. The Ottoman Empire was still standing. Jerusalem had not yet fallen. But it was about to. Let your breathing slow. The weight of these decisions will settle in its own time. For now, we follow the desert warrior, the man who knew too much and carried that knowledge like a stone. Chapter 8. The Man Who Knew Too Much. There are people in history who understand, in real time, that they are participating in a lie, who see the gap between what is being promised and what is actually planned, who carry that knowledge like a wound and keep going anyway. Thomas Edward Lawrence was one of those people. He was 26 years old when the war began, an Oxford-educated archaeologist who had spent years in the Middle East on a dig at Carchemish near the Euphrates and had come to love the Arab world, its languages, its poetry, its dignity, its ancient pride. He spoke Arabic. He wore Arab clothes. He had walked hundreds of miles across the Syrian desert and understood the land in a way that almost no other Englishman did. In 1914, he joined the Arab Bureau in Cairo, the British intelligence operation tasked with managing the Arab Revolt and Arab affairs generally. He was small, intense, eccentric, and brilliant. His superiors found him difficult. The Arabs he worked with found him extraordinary. When the Arab Revolt began in 1916, Lawrence was sent to assess the military situation. He met Prince Faisal, one of Hussein ibn Ali's sons, in the desert, and immediately recognized something. Faisal had charisma and courage and a genuine vision of Arab nationhood. He could be a leader who would carry the revolt beyond tribal raids and into something historic. Lawrence attached himself to Faisal's army, and what followed became one of the most remarkable military partnerships of the 20th century. The Arab forces, under Faisal's leadership and with Lawrence's tactical genius, were not trying to fight the Ottomans in pitched battles. They were too small for that. Instead, they waged a war of movement, of disruption, of psychology. They attacked the Hejaz Railway, the great Ottoman supply line running from Damascus south through the Arabian Peninsula. Train by train, bridge by bridge, they made the railway useless. The Ottoman forces were spread across 500 miles of desert, trying to protect a railway that kept being blown up. They could not concentrate. They could not advance. They were pinned in their garrisons by an invisible enemy that struck and vanished. In the summer of 1917, Lawrence conceived a daring stroke. He led a small force of Arab warriors on a 2-week desert march to attack Aqaba, the port town at the northern tip of the Red Sea. The Ottomans had fortified it against a naval attack from the sea. Lawrence came from the desert, from the direction they had not fortified, from behind. Aqaba fell on the 6th of July, 1917. Lawrence rode into Cairo on a camel to report its capture. He had not slept in 3 days. But through all of this, through all the courage and the desert and the brotherhood of the Arab warriors around the campfires, Lawrence knew. He had been shown the Sykes-Picot Agreement. He knew what Britain and France had secretly agreed. He knew that the Arab independence he was helping to fight for had already been carved up in a London office. He carried this knowledge. He said nothing to Faisal. He kept leading the revolt. Some historians have called this cowardice. Others have called it pragmatism. He believed that if the Arabs could take Damascus, could establish facts on the ground, the political promises might not matter. In October 1918, that moment came. The Ottoman forces had been shattered. The British general Allenby was driving north through Palestine. The Arab forces were racing to Damascus ahead of him. On the 1st of October 1918, the Arab cavalry rode into Damascus. The city, the ancient capital of the Arab world, fell to Arab forces. Lawrence believed that this changed everything, that the Arabs had earned their freedom with their blood. He was wrong. At the Paris Peace Conference the following year, the promises made in the desert were set aside. France took Syria. Lawrence sat in the conference rooms and watched it happen. He argued passionately for Faisal. He was ignored. He resigned from government service and wrote his memoir, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, in a white fury of guilt and grief. I had been sent to these men, he wrote, by my country. I had told them that if they revolted, Britain would give them their freedom. And Britain did not. He spent the rest of his life in a kind of self-imposed penance, enlisting in the army under false names, working as a mechanic and a motorcycle dispatch rider, refusing honors, refusing rank. He died in 1935, 46 years old, in a motorcycle accident on an English country road. He had never forgiven himself. And in the desert encampments where old men still told stories, the name Lawrence was remembered differently by different people. A legend, a traitor, a man who loved deeply, promised nothing he could personally honor, and broke his own heart over the gap between the two. Rest in the quiet. The war is ending. But the peace will be harder than the war. We continue. Chapter 9. The Armenian Darkness. There is a chapter of this story that is difficult to tell. Not because the facts are unclear, they are well documented, but because the weight of what happened requires a moment of stillness before we begin. The Armenians were an ancient Christian people who had lived in eastern Anatolia for thousands of years, long before the Ottomans arrived, long before Islam. Their churches and monasteries dotted the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey, some of them older than medieval Europe, carved from living rock, looking out over valleys that had known Armenian voices for 100 generations. Under the Ottoman Empire, they had been a millet, a recognized religious community, allowed to practice their faith and govern their own communal affairs. They were merchants, craftsmen, intellectuals, farmers. Many of them were deeply integrated into Ottoman life. There were Armenian statesmen, Armenian architects, Armenian musicians who played at the Sultan's court. There were also periodic massacres. In the 1890s, Sultan Abdul Hamid II had sanctioned violence against Armenian communities. Between 50 and 80,000 killed, in waves of organized killing that shocked the world and produced no meaningful international response. When the three pashas came to power, the Armenians watched with a mixture of hope and fear. The early Young Turk ideology had promised equality. Some Armenians supported the revolution of 1908. They believed the new order would be different. It was not. By 1914, the rising Turkish nationalism of the Committee of Union and Progress viewed the Armenians with deep suspicion. The Armenians shared an ethnicity and a faith with some of the Ottoman Empire's enemies, particularly Russia. In the paranoid logic of wartime, Armenian Christians in eastern Anatolia were seen as a potential fifth column, a threat from within. The disaster in the Caucasus in 1914, the catastrophe at Sarikamish, gave Enver Pasha the excuse he needed. The defeat was blamed, in part, on Armenian sabotage and disloyalty. The evidence for this was minimal. The consequence was catastrophic. On the 24th of April, 1915, a date now commemorated as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, the Ottoman government ordered the arrest of 235 Armenian intellectuals and community leaders in Istanbul. They were taken in the night. Most were never seen again. That night was the beginning. What followed was systematic and deliberate. The Armenian population of eastern Anatolia was ordered deported. The word deportation conceals what actually happened. The Armenian men, the young, the strong, those who could fight, were separated from the columns and killed. Women, children, and the elderly were marched south and east into the Syrian desert. There was no food. There was no water. There was no destination. There were guards who beat and robbed and killed the marchers. There were organized killing squads. There were drownings in rivers, mass shootings at the edges of cliffs. People burned alive in buildings. The marches continued for months. Into 1916. Into 1917. The numbers are contested. They always are when states try to erase the evidence of what they have done. Conservative estimates suggest 600,000 dead. Other estimates place the number at 1 million, at 1.5 million. The Armenian population of Anatolia, which had numbered in the millions, was effectively erased. The world did not stop it. The Allied powers made verbal protests. Some diplomats resigned in horror. A few Ottoman officials who tried to protect Armenians were removed or overruled. American Ambassador Henry Morgenthau sent anguished telegrams to Washington, describing what he was witnessing. Washington did not act. The Germans, the Ottomans' allies, knew. German officers in the field witnessed the deportations and the killings. Some protested. Most said nothing. The alliance required silence. In 1915, the British, French, and Russian governments issued a joint statement, the first use in history of the phrase, crimes against humanity. They warned the Ottoman leadership that they would be held personally responsible. And then, consumed by their own war, they moved on. The Ottoman government, the three pashas, never faced justice for what had been done. Talat Pasha was assassinated in Berlin in 1921 by a young Armenian survivor named Sogomon Telirian. He was arrested, tried by a German jury, and acquitted. The jury deciding that what Talat had done was so monstrous that the killing was justified. Enver Pasha died fighting in Central Asia in 1922. Cemal Pasha was assassinated in Tiflis the same year. The Turkish state, to this day, does not use the word genocide. This is a political and legal position, not a historical one. The historical consensus among scholars of the period is overwhelming. An ancient people was almost erased from the land they had inhabited for 3,000 years. This chapter of the story must not be skipped, must not be softened, must not be passed over in the night as if it did not happen. It happened, and the world largely looked away. Let the silence that follows this chapter be intentional, a pause of acknowledgement. We continue only when you are ready. Chapter 10. The Carving. The 11th of November, 1918. An armistice. A silence. The guns stopped. After 4 years and 3 months of industrial slaughter, after 17 million dead, after the map of Europe redrawn in blood, after 4 empires shattered, the war was over. The Ottoman Empire had surrendered 5 weeks earlier, on the 30th of October, signing the Armistice of Mudros on a British warship in the Aegean Sea. The empire that had fought on 4 fronts simultaneously, that had held Gallipoli and endured to the end, had nothing left. No army, no treasury, no allies, no hope. Allied warships sailed into Istanbul harbour. British, French, and Italian troops occupied the city. The Sultan, Mehmed VI, a weak and frightened man, sat in his palace and watched the empire his ancestors had built over 6 centuries reduced to a protectorate of the victorious powers. The great men gathered in Paris. January 1919. The Paris Peace Conference, the most consequential peace conference in modern history. Woodrow Wilson arrived with his 14 points, his vision for a new world order based not on empire and secret deals, but on national self-determination, democratic governance, and an international organization to prevent future wars. Wilson was celebrated across the world. In Paris, crowds lined the streets to cheer him. And then the conference began. The reality of the Paris Peace Conference was very different from its idealism. The men who actually made the decisions, Wilson, Lloyd George of Britain, Clemenceau of France, each had their own priorities, their own red lines, their own imperial interests dressed in the language of principle. Self-determination, it turned out, was for European peoples, for white Christian peoples, not for Arabs, not for Armenians, not for the peoples of Africa and Asia who had also fought in the war, often at the explicit invitation of the imperial powers who now divided their lands. The Sykes-Picot lines were formalized and dressed up in new legal language. The League of Nations, Wilson's great creation, invented the mandate system. Under this system, certain territories were too undeveloped to govern themselves. They needed guidance from more advanced nations. That guidance would be provided by Britain and France. It was colonialism with a conscience, empire with a human rights clause. Britain received the mandate for Palestine, for Mesopotamia, which it renamed Iraq, and for what would become Transjordan. France received the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. When Prince Faisal, the Arab leader who had led the Arab revolt, who had ridden into Damascus in triumph in 1918, who had come to Paris to plead for Arab independence, was told that Syria would be placed under French mandate, he was devastated. He argued. He appealed to Wilson's principles. He was ignored. France sent its army to Damascus in July 1920. Faisal was expelled. In his place, the British consoled him with the throne of Iraq, a country that had been invented by drawing lines on a map encompassing Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations that had no history of shared governance. Faisal was a Hashemite from the Hejaz. He had never been to Mesopotamia. He did not speak its dialects. He became king of Iraq by appointment of the British Empire. His brother Abdullah, another of Hussein's sons, was given the territory of Transjordan, east of the Jordan River. A British civil servant named Winston Churchill, now colonial secretary, presided over a conference in Cairo in 1921 that drew the final borders of the modern Middle East in a single week. 1 week. To draw the borders that 100 years of conflict have not yet resolved. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August 1920, attempted to partition Anatolia itself. Kurdistan would have a homeland. Armenia would have recognized territory. Greece would take large swaths of western Anatolia and Thrace. It was the final humiliation of a dying empire. But it was also a miscalculation, because in Anatolia, something unexpected was happening. A general who had won at Gallipoli and survived the war was watching all of this, and he had absolutely no intention of accepting it. His name was Mustafa Kemal, and he was about to do something that no other defeated power in this entire war had managed. He was going to win. Let the Paris rooms fall quiet in your mind. The negotiators have gone home, the maps are signed, the mandates are issued. But the story is not over. Not yet.
Chapter 11. The Phoenix.
There is a particular kind of courage that emerges only when everything has been taken away, when there is nothing left to lose. When the treaties have been signed and the occupiers have arrived, and the great powers have divided what remains. When the very land beneath your feet has been promised to someone else. It is in that moment, that impossible, bottomless moment, that some men find their truest selves. Mustafa Kemal found his in the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. In May 1919, Kemal was sent to Anatolia by the Sultan's government, sent, ironically, to disarm the remaining Ottoman forces there and supervise the implementation of the armistice terms. The great powers wanted the Anatolian interior pacified. The Sultan, dependent on Allied goodwill for his throne, complied. But Kemal had no intention of disarming anything. He stepped ashore at Samsun on the Black Sea coast on the 19th of May, 1919. He looked at the Allied warships in the harbor. He looked at the Greek troops already landing on the Aegean coast at Smyrna. He looked at the French occupying Cilicia in the south, and he made a decision. He began organizing a resistance. Working with extraordinary speed and skill, he convened a series of nationalist congresses at Erzurum, at Sivas, that established a new political authority, separate from the Sultan in Istanbul, and explicitly dedicated to the defense of Anatolia. The Turkish heartland. The core. His message was simple and devastating. The Sultan had surrendered. The Sultan had accepted the terms of the great powers, but the Sultan did not speak for the Turkish people. The Turkish people would speak for themselves, and they were not going to give up their homeland. The war that followed, the Turkish War of Independence, lasted from 1919 to 1922. It was fought on multiple fronts simultaneously, against Greek forces advancing from the Aegean coast, against French forces in the south, against Armenian forces in the east, against an Italian presence on the Mediterranean coast. The Greek campaign was the most dangerous. The Greek army, Backed by British diplomatic support and the expansionist vision of Greek Prime Minister Venizelos, pushed deep into Anatolia, aiming to reclaim the territory that Greeks had inhabited for thousands of years. By 1921, they had advanced to within 50 miles of Ankara, the city Kemal had chosen as the base of his new government. At the Battle of Sakarya in August and September 1921, Kemal took personal command. He issued an order that became historic. There is no line of defense. There is only a surface of defense, and that surface is the whole fatherland. Every inch of the fatherland is to be defended until it is soaked in the blood of its citizens. The Greeks were stopped, then slowly, painfully driven back. In August 1922, the final offensive began. The Great Offensive. The Turkish forces moved with a speed and ferocity that shocked the world. Within days, the Greek front collapsed. Within weeks, the Turkish army was at the sea. In September 1922, Smyrna, the great cosmopolitan port city on the Aegean, home to enormous Greek and Armenian populations, was recaptured. What followed was one of the final catastrophes of this era. The city burned, thousands died, and the Greek and Armenian populations fled in boats to whatever safety they could find. Europe was stunned. Britain mobilized, briefly considering intervention, then stood down. The war was over. Kemal had won. On the 1st of November 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was abolished. Mehmed VI, the last sultan of a 6th century dynasty, left Istanbul quietly at night, slipping away on a British warship. He carried almost nothing. He did not look back. The Treaty of Lausanne was signed on the 24th of July, 1923. It replaced the humiliating Treaty of Sèvres entirely. The new Turkish Republic received international recognition of its borders, the borders of modern Turkey, largely as they stand today. No Kurdistan, no Armenian territory, no Greek zones, no foreign mandates over Anatolia. It was the only peace treaty after the First World War that was negotiated by a defeated power on equal terms. On the 29th of October 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed. Mustafa Kemal became its first president. He would take a new name, given to him by a grateful parliament: Ataturk, father of the Turks. The empire was dead. Something new, something singular, had risen from its ruins. Let that courage settle in the room with you tonight. The phoenix did not need wings. It only needed the will to rise.